December 1924. The small village of Crowborough, Sussex, was a place of quiet English respectability. Terraced houses lined the streets, farms dotted the countryside. It was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbours, where scandals were whispered about over garden fences. But in December of that year, a darkness descended on Crowborough that would shock the nation. On a small poultry farm on the outskirts of the village, a young woman would die. Her body would be dismembered, and her remains would be buried beneath the very chickens that her killer farmed. This is the story of John Norman Holmes Thorne, a Sunday school teacher, a failed electrical engineer, and a murderer. And this is the story of Elsie Emily Cameron, the woman he promised to marry and then chose to kill. Welcome to Mysteria World. I'm Muzamal, and today we examine one of 1925's most notorious cases, the Chicken Run murder. Sussex in the 1920s was a county in transition. The First World War had ended only 6 years earlier, but its shadow still hung over the landscape. The great estates of the aristocracy still dominated the county, but the rise of industrialisation and suburban development was beginning to change the traditional rural character. Crowborough, specifically, was a small village in the High Weald region of Sussex. It was known as a quiet, respectable place, the kind of village where people went to escape the hurly-burly of London. The village had grown in the late Victorian and early Edwardian periods, as people with money had chosen to build homes there. The landscape was a mixture of farmland, woods, and residential properties. Small farms dotted the area. Poultry farming was common. It was a way for people to make a living without needing extensive land or capital investment. Into this world of respectability came John Norman Holmes Thorne. He was educated, well-mannered, and involved in the community. He taught at the Sunday school. He was seen as a decent, ordinary man. No one would have suspected him of the capacity for violence that would soon be revealed. The 1920s were also a time of changing morality, particularly regarding relationships between men and women. The Great War had disrupted traditional courtship patterns. Young men and women had more freedom to associate with each other. Engagements and relationships could be formed and dissolved with less family oversight than had been the case in previous generations. Yet the underlying expectation remained. A man who became engaged to a woman had a responsibility to her. He could not simply discard her when another woman caught his eye. The violation of this expectation, the betrayal of an engagement, would later become central to understanding the motive for murder in this case. John Norman Holmes Thorne was born into a respectable middle-class family. His father had money, which meant that Thorne had received an education and training as an electrical engineer. For a time, he worked in that profession, but Thorne lacked something crucial: ambition, drive, and perhaps the ability to connect with others in meaningful ways. By his mid-20s, Thorne had left electrical engineering. With a £100 investment from his father, he had established a small poultry farm on the outskirts of Crowborough. It was a modest enterprise, not a grand agricultural venture, but rather a place where chickens were raised and eggs were sold. On the surface, Thorne seemed unremarkable. He was of average appearance, he was quiet and reserved. He was respectable, a Sunday school teacher after all. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability lurked something darker. A man capable of manipulation, capable of violence, and ultimately capable of murder. Elsie Emily Cameron was a young woman from London. She was 26 years old in 1924, vivacious and friendly. She had come to know Thorne through family connections, and the two had become involved in a romantic relationship around 1920. By Christmas 1922, they had become engaged to be married. Cameron gave Thorne an engagement ring. She spoke to him about their future. She believed that they would marry and build a life together. But Thorne's feelings were more complicated. Or perhaps they were less complicated than Cameron's. He had married her in his mind, not to love, but to possess. And when he discovered another woman, Elizabeth Caldecott, he began to regret his engagement to Cameron. The tragedy that would unfold was rooted in this divergence of feeling. Cameron wanted marriage and a shared future. Thorne wanted to be rid of the obligation that Cameron represented. When Cameron would not simply disappear from his life, Thorne chose a final, brutal solution. For nearly 3 years, Thorne and Cameron were engaged. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Cameron would visit the farm. Thorne would come to London to see her. They discussed wedding plans. To the outside world, they were a couple preparing for marriage. But privately, Thorne was unhappy. He had become involved with another woman, Elizabeth Caldecott. The exact nature of his feelings for Caldecott is unclear from historical records, but what is clear is that Thorne wanted to be free of his engagement to Cameron. In late 1924, he made his desire known. He told Cameron that he wanted to end their engagement. He asked her to return the engagement ring. Cameron was devastated. She had believed in their future together. She had given Thorne years of her life, her affection, her trust. Now, with no warning, he was casting her aside. But Cameron did not simply disappear. She did not accept the rejection quietly. Instead, she pressed Thorne. She wanted to know why he was ending the engagement. She wanted to understand what she had done wrong. She may have hoped to convince him to change his mind. This pressure, this refusal to simply vanish from his life, became, in Thorne's mind, intolerable. He could not be free of her. She would not leave him alone. She would not accept his rejection. And so, in December 1924, Thorne made a decision. Instead of simply ending the engagement, he decided to end Cameron herself. Cameron came to the farm in early December. The exact circumstances of her arrival are unclear, whether she came by invitation or whether she came to press Thorne about the engagement. But on December 5th, 1924, she was at the farm. And on that day, Thorne killed her. What happened on December 5th, 1924, in Thorne's hut on the poultry farm will never be known in complete detail. Only Thorne knew the truth, and he would later give conflicting accounts of what occurred. What is known from the evidence is that Elsie Cameron died that day. She did not die peacefully or of natural causes. She died from blows to the head and from injuries inflicted upon her body. The medical evidence would later suggest shock and trauma as the cause of death. Thorne's own account, his confession, if you can call it that, was that Cameron had committed suicide. He claimed that she had hanged herself from a beam in his hut, that she had taken her own life in despair at his rejection. His story was that he had simply buried her body, concealing the death in a panic. But this story had serious problems. When investigators examined the beam from which Cameron allegedly hanged herself, they found no marks consistent with such a use. The beam showed no rope burn, no evidence of pressure. The story simply did not match the physical evidence. More damning was the evidence of Sir Bernard Spilsbury, one of the most renowned pathologists in England. Spilsbury examined Cameron's remains and concluded that she had not hanged herself. The injuries to her body were consistent with being struck on the head, with being beaten, essentially. The injuries were consistent with murder, not with suicide. What likely happened, what Thorne probably did, was this. Cameron came to the farm. Thorne told her, once and for all, that their engagement was over, that he did not want to see her anymore. Cameron may have reacted emotionally. She may have pleaded with him. She may have tried to convince him to change his mind. In response, Thorne struck her. Perhaps his blow was meant only to silence her, to stop her from talking. But it was more serious than that. It fractured her skull. It caused internal injuries. It shocked her body so severely that she died. Faced with a dead body and the prospect of being accused of murder, Thorne made another decision. He would dispose of the body. He would try to make it appear that she had simply vanished. He would bury her on his property, under the chicken run, where no one would think to look. Using an axe or a similar tool, Thorne dismembered Cameron's body. He severed her head. He cut off her legs. He separated the body into pieces that could be buried in different locations on the farm. Then, with a terrible and meticulous care, he buried these pieces. Some went under the chicken run, hence the name that would later attach itself to the case, the Chicken Run Murder. Other pieces were buried elsewhere on the property. When this grim work was done, Thorne cleaned up. He hid the evidence. And then he set about creating a story to explain Cameron's disappearance. He told people that Cameron had left the farm. He suggested that she had returned to London. He implied that perhaps she had gone to be with another man. He created a narrative in which her absence was normal, expected, unremarkable. But he had underestimated the determination of Cameron's family. Her relatives would not accept the story that she had simply vanished. And he had underestimated the investigative power of Scotland Yard. Segment 6. Discovery and Investigation. Building Momentum. When Elsie Cameron did not return to London, her family became concerned. They contacted Thorne and demanded to know where she was. Thorne gave them vague answers. He said that she must have left on her own. He expressed surprise that she had not made contact with her family. But the Cameron family was not satisfied. They contacted the police. They reported Elsie as missing. And on January 15th, 1925, more than a month after Cameron's death, the police arrived at Thorne's farm with a search warrant. The investigators had little to go on initially. There was no body, no obvious evidence of foul play. But they had suspicion. And they had the determined work of Scotland Yard's finest detectives. They began to search the farm. They looked through Thorne's hut. They examined his possessions. And in his hut, they found something extraordinary. Newspaper clippings about a murder that had occurred in 1924. The clippings described the Crumbles murders, a case in which a woman's body had been dismembered and buried on a Sussex beach. The possession of these clippings was highly suspicious. It suggested that Thorne had been thinking about how to dispose of a body. It suggested premeditation. It suggested that he had studied a previous case to understand how to conceal evidence. But the most important discovery was still to come. When the investigators dug beneath the chicken run, they found Elsie Cameron's remains. They found her head. They found her legs. They found the physical evidence of murder. With this evidence, Thorne's story of suicide quickly crumbled. He was arrested and brought to the police. Was the evidence of guilt truly overwhelming, or was an innocent man executed based on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of medical experts who could be wrong? The case is notable for the number of people who believed, even at the time, that a miscarriage of justice may have occurred. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's doubts about the case were widely known. A jury member expressed reservations about the conviction. Even legal experts have since re-examined the evidence and found it less conclusive than might appear. The central problem is this. While Thorne certainly dismembered a body, the evidence that he murdered the person is not as clear-cut as one might think. Could Cameron, in her despair at being rejected, have taken her own life? Could Thorne have found her dead and, in panic, hidden the body? These questions cannot be answered with absolute certainty. What we can say with certainty is that Elsie Emily Cameron is dead. We can say that John Norman Holmes Thorne disposed of her body. We can say that he lied to police and to the court about what happened. But whether he murdered her, or whether he was guilty of a terrible panic in response to a suicide, remains in some sense open to question. The trial of John Norman Holmes Thorne took place at the Lewis Assizes in March 1925. The courtroom was packed with journalists and spectators. The case had captured public imagination. Here was a man of respectable appearance, a Sunday school teacher, accused of a brutal murder. The prosecution, led by Sir Henry Curtis Bennett, presented a compelling case. They presented the medical evidence from Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the renowned pathologist. Spilsbury testified that Cameron had not hanged herself. The injuries to her body were consistent with violence, with blows to the head. The evidence was clear. This was murder, not suicide. The prosecution presented the newspaper clippings, evidence that Thorne had studied a previous dismemberment case. They presented the fact that Thorne had hidden the body. They presented his own confession, his admission that he had dismembered the remains. The defence, led by J.D. Castles, argued that Cameron had hanged herself. They argued that Thorne, finding her dead, had panicked and hidden the body, attempting to dispose of it to avoid scandal. They argued that disposing of a body did not necessarily mean committing murder. A man could find a woman dead and, in fear for his own safety, choose to hide what had happened. Thank you for joining me on this examination of the Chicken Run murder. The case of John Norman Holmes Thorne and Elsie Emily Cameron remains one of Britain's most controversial capital cases. If you found this historical documentary compelling, please like, subscribe, and share this video with others. Tell me in the comments, do you think Thorne was guilty beyond reasonable doubt? Or do you believe this case represents a miscarriage of justice? I'm Muzamal, and I'll see you in the next episode of Mysterious World, where we continue to explore the complicated, tragic stories of Britain's criminal past. Thank you for watching.